There is certainly no shortage of tales of chivalry and piety within the historical annals of medieval Germany, but beneath the surface lay some darker stories. Those people whose deeds recall a modern concept of a serial killer. And indeed, we often imagine serial murder in this modern pathology. Yet historical records and legends from the late medieval period reveal that multiple murderers stalked the highways and villages of the Holy Roman Empire long before the term was coined. Let's just take one example. One 16th century German pamphlet reports the capture of a highwayman said to have murdered 964 people over a 13-year period. That's a staggering figure, don't you think? Perhaps it strains a bit of credibility, but it certainly set contemporaries aghast, and has secured a place in history for that man, Christman Genipperteinga, the bandit whose supposed crimes made him a near mythical boogeyman. But take it with a grain of salt, whether such numbers were true or not. Perhaps even a fraction of these numbers would be just as frightening. But in any case, the very circulation of these reports shows that medieval Germans were keenly aware of, and perhaps even morbidly fascinated by, the possibility of monsters in their midst. And so today we tell a not very often told story about those evil doers, the unpleasant ones, the killers of medieval Germany. Well, if you've got the guts, come with me, and we can spend the next hour together. But allow me first to welcome you to the channel. If you are new here, perhaps you'd like to hit the subscribe button. And let me remind you that we are sponsored by no one. Actually, we rely on just word of mouth to spread this channel and a bit of engagement, so a like, subscribe, and a comment always helps. And speaking of support, we are supported by the members on Patreon, YouTube memberships, the merch store, and we are also supported by the occasional donation through Super Thanks and the Patreon, PayPal link rather, excuse me. That's what helps us keep all of the videos, I mean all of them on this channel, ad-free. No interruptions from start to finish for your enjoyment. Now, with all that being said, let's get on with the video. Now, of course, like the other ancient and medieval countries that we've covered, medieval Germany was like them in the terms that they did not have this formal word for serial killer. But the concept did manifest in the figure of the Mehrfachtäter, a repeat murderer, basically, or repeat offender, this kind of thing. Often a bandit or roving criminal who killed multiple people over time. Now, it is a little bit unlike the modern stereotype of a lone predator with a more psychopathic motive. Many medieval multiple murderers were just outlaws, and they were driven more by familiar impulses, greed, revenge, sometimes just opportunistic violence. In any case, they were typically highway robbers, mercenary deserters, or just brigands who found it easier to leave no witnesses by killing their victims after emptying their pockets. Your money or your life, this kind of thing. Yet contemporaries often perceive these criminals not as ordinary thieves, but as almost inhuman evildoers, sometimes even in league with diabolic forces, depending on who you ask. The medieval mindset readily blended this criminality with monstrosity, especially when crimes were unusually heinous or repeated. On travel in German lands during the later Middle Ages, that could be perilous too. You had to watch your back. Now, the empire's fragmented political landscape, dotted with these small principalities, free cities, church lands, and even knightly estates, meant that law enforcement was decentralized and inconsistent. Outside of those fortified city walls, travelers and merchants braving the forests and country roads faced the threat of banditry at all times. And indeed, the German word Raubritter, that is robber, knight, entered lore as a nobleman who forsook chivalry to waylay wayfarers for loot. Oh, and by the way, I'll do my best not to murder the German pronunciations. I am looking them up as I go. I'm sure if I make any mistakes, I'll be duly told in the comments section. Now, not all these figures literally committed serial murder, that's one thing we have to remember, but violence was inherent in their trade. Some, however, went far beyond simple robbery. Records from the 14th through the 16th centuries indicate bands of roving thieves who pillaged and often killed. The concept of a notorious killer roaming the woods, it didn't take long for that to take root in the popular imagination. Medieval chronicles and legal records occasionally note such criminals who killed many, though typically without the forensic detail of a modern crime report. But one crucial difference in medieval serial killings is that many were not solitary actors. You see, it was common for murderous bandits to operate in gangs for mutual protection, and these loosely organized gangs could splinter and reform, making it hard for authorities to capture every single one of them. If caught, such bandits might confess to multiple murders or committed collectively or perhaps individually. These confessions come frequently extracted under torture, by the way. One of the reasons why we have the numerical tallies of victims that appear so shockingly high, and that's why we have to approach these numbers critically. Torture could produce exaggerated or false confessions as prisoners sought to appease interrogators, anything to stop them from, well, putting the screws on your thumbs. Well, yet even discounting some inflation, it is clear that certain criminals in late medieval Germany did commit a terrifying series of murders. And then there's the cultural context. That also shaped how serial violence was understood. Medieval Europeans often explained repeated or especially cruel murders in supernatural terms. A killer who showed no remorse, who violated the usual taboos such as killing children or even cannibalism, might be thought literally possessed by evil, demonic forces getting into his mind and body and acting on his behalf. After all, it was unimaginable for a human being in those very sensible times to commit such heinous acts in the eyes of most pious people. And so, in German lands of the 1500s, this coincided with the witch-hunting fervor too, and significantly with sporadic werewolf panics. Full video on that soon. Now, werewolf trials became a phenomenon in parts of Europe roughly between 1450 and 1650. In regions like the Rhineland and Lorraine, which at the time was in the Western Holy Roman Empire, some men were accused of transforming into wolves to devour people. And it's not a coincidence that several early serial killer cases in Germany were entangled with this werewolf lore, as we'll see with the infamous case of Peter Stumpp. Well, to the medieval mind, a serial murderer might not just be a wicked human, he could literally be a wolf man or a sorcerer. And the devil was often involved in these stories too, indicating that people struggled to comprehend how a man could kill repeatedly without an ounce of conscience. And so by casting the criminal as a demonic figure, society began to make sense of the senseless. But at the same time, there were pragmatic concerns that were present too. Authorities feared the breakdown of public order that a murderous outlaw represented. The late 16th century in particular saw crime waves, or at least a perception of rising violent crime in the German territories. Well, it has been noted that in the 1570s and 80s, reports of roaming robber bands multiplied across the Holy Roman Empire, from Moravia in today's Czech Republic to Switzerland, and from Württemberg in the southwest up to Bremen in the north. And this coincided with a period of social upheaval. Wars and religious conflicts, like the tail end of the Reformation, had displaced people, while economic hardships made robbery a little bit more tempting. It was precisely the era when the printing press enabled cheap broadsheets and pamphlets to spread sensational news. Thus, tales of serial murderers pretty much went viral in the early modern terms, fueling public fear, but also selling a lot of newspapers. While the authorities responded with intensified law enforcement and draconian punishments. In some German cities, the late 1500s saw execution rates spike to unprecedented levels, a trend possibly linked to cracking down on banditry and repeat offenders. For example, in the imperial city of Augsburg, records show that the proportion of convicted criminals who were executed roughly doubled in the last few decades of the 16th century compared to earlier periods. And Nuremberg, too. They recorded a notable surge in executions during the 1580s and 90s, after which the numbers fell in the 17th century. Well, this certainly indicates a concerted effort to extirpate the roving killers causing all this panic. In short, medieval German society was facing its serial murderers, was a mix of horror, moral panic, kind of a spiritual lens too, but ultimately a harsh justice. And all of that is reflected within the historical accounts that we will now go on to talk about. Well, let's talk about the genuine historical figures often cited. One of them that often comes up is Europe's first serial killer, depending on who you ask. That is Peter Niers, also spelled Niers. Well, he's an outlaw whose crimes and punishment were documented in 16th century sources. Peter Niers was a German bandit leader active during the 1570s until his capture in 1581. According to contemporary pamphlets and court records, Niers and his gang terrorized the regions of southwestern Germany, the Rhineland, Alsace, that sort of thing, with a long spree of robbery, murder, and even alleged black magic, though that's a little bit harder to find evidence for. While the truth of some claims is uncertain, Niers' story provides a vivid example of how far a medieval multiple murderer's notoriety could spread, and how his legend could grow in the telling. So who was Peter Niers? By his own confession, once again extracted under torture, he was a murderer, many hundreds of times over. In fact, Niers reputedly admitted to 544 murders. Now that's another astonishing number. Not quite up to the 900. Still quite large, though. And this number, reported in official warrants and a popular ballad of the time, included a litany of horrors. Among his victims were 24 pregnant women, from whom Niers claimed to have cut out the fetuses. These unborn infants' bodies were said to be used in occult rituals, another ghastly detail that convinced many that Niers was not just a thief, but a practitioner of vile, dark magic. It was also alleged that he cannibalized parts of these fetuses and used their remains to work black magic, including spells of invisibility. Well, such accusations might sound a little bit fantastical by today's standards, but they appear in multiple contemporary sources about Niers, and we must remember that confessions under torture often mix the truth with whatever the interrogators wanted to hear. You did this, didn't you? Didn't you? People will say anything, once again, to get the torture to stop. It is highly unlikely that Niers truly killed 500 people, though that would average an impossible murder spree sustained every week for 15 years. In any case, even if the real victim count was a fraction of that, he was clearly considered a monstrosity, a prolific killer by the authorities of the time. And, well, perhaps killing even 10%, 50 people is still not good. So they portrayed him as almost a demonic menace, lurking on the crossroads of an empire. But here's the thing. Niers did not act entirely alone. He was part of a loosely knit network of brigands in the war-torn landscapes of 16th century Central Europe. In that era, bands of dispossessed soldiers, mercenaries, and criminals often roamed the countryside. Niers himself apparently rose to leadership of one of such bandit network. It was said that earlier in his career, if we want to call it that he learned the outlaw trade from a mentor, an older brigand named Martin Stier, who had led a notorious gang of 49 robbers in the 1550s to 60s. Stier's gang ranged from the Low Countries down to Württemberg in Swabia, plundering and killing along the way, until Stier was caught and executed in 1572. As for Peter Niers, he inherited this underworld legacy, and by the late 1570s, he and his associate named Johannes Buchler, called Jacob Sumer in some accounts, led a sizable crew of cutthroats. They would sometimes assemble a large force of 24 men for major raids, then break into smaller groups or pairs to cover more territory between the big heists. They struck travelers on lonely roads, attacked isolated farmhouses, and even at times besieged inns. We have a pamphlet from the time. It recounts how Niers' gang convened near the town of Pfalzberg with about 24 members. There, according to legend, they held a dark meeting with the devil himself. And when the devil showed up, he gave Niers and his lieutenant a ritual blessing. He even apparently paid them a monthly retainer in exchange for their souls. Pretty sensational, clearly colored by folk belief. But once again it shows how people at the time viewed such criminals. They weren't just mere bandits, but satanic agents sowing chaos in the mortal world. But in reality, and perhaps from a bit more secular standpoint, the gang's depredations were very human. As the authorities closed in, captured underlings of Niers provided information. A warrant issued in 1579 described Niers' method of evasion. He reportedly was a master of disguise, able to change his appearance and clothing at will. Sometimes he masqueraded as a soldier, other times a humble beggar, or even a leper, and that's one way to get people to not approach you. But the warrant did note, however, that certain traits gave him away. He always carried plenty of money. He went armed with a pair of pistols in his trousers, and wielded a giant two-handed sword. Later descriptions add that he had a long scar on his chin and a couple of crooked fingers, features that an alert person might notice despite his costume change. But in any case, for a time, he proved to be elusive. That was until 1577, where he was actually arrested, along with some of his cohorts. But in that early brush with the law, he managed to escape jail under unclear circumstances. It might have been a daring breakout. It could have been old-fashioned bribery. Either way, the result was the same. Niers was let loose. After that, the authorities pursued him with even greater determination. Songs and broadsheets from 1580 to 81 indicate that Niers had become a figure of dread among the common folk, quite literally a bogeyman. Parents in some areas purportedly warned unruly children that if they misbehaved, that Peter Niers would come for them. And this was not entirely hyperbole. Niers was accused of abducting and murdering numerous children, perhaps part of those alleged occult practices. One macabre folk song verses about him survived, describing his arch-evil character and listing the towns where he and his gang had left their victims. But finally, The fall of Niers came in the summer of 1581. By then, he had been on the run for years. According to a famous account, Niers arrived incognito at the town of Neumarkt in Bavaria. Well, he lodged at a tavern in September of 1581 called Zum Glocken, that is, the bells. Feeling relatively safe, he relaxed there for a couple of days. At one point, he visited the public bathhouse, a pretty common pastime. But crucially, he left behind a certain satchel in the care of the innkeeper. This was to be his undoing. The legend goes that while Niers was bathing, one of the other patrons, or perhaps the bath attendant himself, grew suspicious that this stranger resembled descriptions of a wanted outlaw. A whisper went through the bathhouse that Peter Niers might be in their midst, and something like that ought to spread pretty fast. Unaware of the mounting alarm around him, Niers soaked in the bath as two brave citizens slipped out and hurried to the inn. They asked the innkeeper to inspect the bag Niers had left behind, and upon opening it, they found something that was quite horrifying. Inside the bag were severed human remains, specifically a collection of hands and hearts said to be from fetuses or infants. Well, that seems to be evidence enough, and there was no doubt that their guest was indeed the infamous murderer. So a posse of 8 armed townsmen assembled on the spot, and Niers, finally realizing that the jig was up, tried to flee. But without his bag of magical fetuses, which in the law was the source of his invisibility spell, he had no chance of getting away unseen. So he was overpowered and captured. Confronted with the contents of the bag, Niers confessed to his true identity, and with that, a long list of crimes. Now, I'm sure you can imagine that what followed was an execution of spectacular brutality, even by the standards of the age. Medieval and early modern executions often doubled as public theatre, moral lessons in physical form, a warning making an example of someone. Yet the punishment of Peter Niers, even among all of that cruelty, stands out for its extra uniqueness, which was perhaps intended to match the extraordinary cruelty of his deeds. In any case, it's hard to feel sorry for him. Contemporary reports detail that Niers' execution was carried out over the course of 3 days of agonizing torture in Neumarkt. On the first day, the executioners used red-hot tongs to tear strips of flesh from his body in 10 different places, and then they poured hot oil into the wounds to compound the agony. On the second day, they smeared his feet with grease and roasted them slowly over burning coals, effectively roasting him alive by degrees. Only on the third day was Niers finally granted release by death. He was lashed to the breaking wheel, an instrument of execution where the body is shattered by blows. The heavy iron-rimmed wheel was raised and smashed down on him 42 times, systematically crushing bone after bone. For context, even a severe breaking typically might involve 8 or 9 blows, but Niers' punishment was on a whole other level, basically turning his body into a bag of crushed-up peanuts, if we want to be a bit more descriptive. Sure, you'll pardon the metaphor, it's the best I can come up with. Well, remarkably, after 42 blows, Niers was reportedly still alive. So he was then mercifully finished off by quartering. Not the best mercy, but it's all he's getting. That is, his body was cut into 4 different parts. His head, as some sources say, just his remains perhaps, was displayed on a stake or a wheel, as a warning to any who might follow in his footsteps. And of course, the execution was widely publicized. Pamphlets about his gruesome end circulated through the empire's cities. and one can only imagine the mixture of relief and morbid fascination with which the people read of this arch-murderer's demise. In these reports, Niers is often depicted as more monster than man, emphasizing his pact with the devil, his practice of witchcraft and cannibalistic acts, and such elements made him a figure of folklore as much as crime history. In fact, some historians suspect that later legendary serial killers, even fictitious ones, were inspired by Niers. For example, the supposed exploits of Christman Genipperteinga, which we mention in the introduction and will discuss next in more detail, may have borrowed some details from Niers' real story. In any case, by the end of 1581, Peter's reign of terror was over, and with it, all of Germany lived happily ever after. I'm afraid not. There's more suffering to come. So let's move on to our next chapter. So if Peter Niers was the arch-killer grounded in reality, Christman Genipperteinga represents the era's most legendary serial killer, and it is one whose existence is sometimes questioned by historians. So let's get on to him. Now, Christman Genipperteinga, the name, by the way, is quite a mouthful itself. Sometimes has different variations, like Nipperdolinga. He was reportedly executed in June of 1581 for an unbelievable tally of murders. We mentioned it earlier. The figure given was 964 victims over 13 years, and that would make him, by far, the most prolific serial murderer in all of recorded history. So where does this claim originate? Well, it comes from a 1581 pamphlet, specifically a news pamphlet, published shortly after the alleged events. According to that account, written by one Caspar Herbert of Cochem, Genipperteinga was a brigand who operated near the borders of the Spanish Netherlands and the Holy Roman Empire. In modern terms, if you know your geography, that's the Moselle Valley near Trier and Luxembourg. But the story reads almost like a grisly fairy tale. And indeed, many elements parallel folklore. It's hard to go through it without a raised eyebrow. As the pamphlet tells it, Christman Genipperteinga lived in a cave complex in a forest hill known as the Fraburg. He had started his life of crime around 1569. From his hidden lair, which was reportedly well furnished with stolen goods, he could surveil the roads linking important towns like Trier, Metz, Thionville, etc., and waylay travelers at will. Over years, he robbed and murdered hundreds. A mine shaft connected to his cave served as the dumping ground for the bodies. In one particular ghastly twist, Genipperteinga kidnapped a young woman and kept her as a captive for 7 years as his unwilling concubine. She was forced to be his wife in this underground abode, and even bore him children, whom, quite horrifically, Genipperteinga killed at birth. The pamphlet graphically describes how he would press the infants' necks and sometimes hang the tiny corpses on hooks. And there is a chilling line, too. Genipperteinga taunts the grieving mother by pointing at the swaying little bodies and exclaiming, "Dance, little children, dance. Your father, Genipperteinga, is making you dance." That's a gruesome image, isn't it? Literally puppeteering the corpses of his own offspring. Something out of a nightmare. Once again, raised eyebrows, clearly meant to shock the reader's conscience. But the eventual downfall of Christman Genipperteinga comes when his enslaved wife manages to escape the cave. The story goes that he finally allowed her a brief visit to a nearby town, Berncastel or Trier, depending on the version, after she swore not to betray him. But of course, once among the people, the young woman broke down, and, encouraged by priests and officials, confessed what she had endured. She cleverly led authorities back to the hideout by leaving a trail of peas along the way, a detail curiously reminiscent of fairy tales like Hansel and Gretel, once again with the eyebrow. A band of 30 armed men followed the trail, then surprised Genipperteinga in his cave, and captured him, along with an astounding trove of stolen riches. Tens of thousands of gulden worth of coins, armor, wine, and goods accumulated from his victims. They also supposedly found his diary, in which he meticulously tallied the number of people he killed, 964 by his own count, and of course the loot that came with each crime. When confronted, the bandit freely admitted to the murders, and even expressed regret, only that he had not reached his goal of 1,000. Oh, unsurprisingly, the punishment was gruesome. Genipperteinga was sentenced to death by breaking on the wheel, the famous radebrechen. And in keeping with the tale's extraordinary nature, it was said that he survived on the breaking wheel for 9 days. The executioners intentionally kept him alive. Each day, according to the pamphlet, they fed the mangled but conscious man a strong drink, likely fortified wine or spirits, to prolong the agony. For over a week, the legendary murderer languished, every limb shattered and woven through the spokes of the wheel, a living spectacle of divine justice, until he finally expired. The protracted torture is, again, a hyperbolic element that strains belief. Even the toughest constitution could scarcely survive that long. But, as a more moral drama, I suppose, it conveyed to the public that such an evildoer was made to suffer as never before. But what about the big question? Did he actually exist? Well, we're not sure. There's more than a few skeptical historians. Unlike Peter Niers, whose exploits appear in multiple independent records, Genipperteinga's story seems to derive almost entirely from a single source, that 1581 pamphlet, which was then copied and embellished by later writers. There are no surviving court records or town chronicles from the area that mention the arrest or execution of such a man in 1581, even though breaking wheel executions were usually noted. This absence of a local archival evidence raises quite a few doubts. Moreover, some elements of the tale, the extraordinarily high body count, the keeping of a victim as a wife, the trail of peas, the 9-day survival on the wheel, they sound like literary inventions or folklore motives rather than plausible history. And indeed, scholars have pointed out that similar tales of prolific robber-murderers circulated in German oral tradition, and the name Genipperteinga itself is unusual, and may have been a local boogeyman nickname, who knows. But here's something else interesting. 19th century folklorists, including the brothers Grimm, collected versions of a legend of a robber named Nipperdollinger, or Papadonner, which clearly relate to Christman Genipperteinga. In some northern German dialects, figures called Papadonne or Lippold appear in stories as child-murdering thieves or evil underground dwellers. It's quite possible that the Genipperteinga pamphlet was a sensationalized news piece that blended a kernel of truth. Perhaps there was a notorious cave-dwelling thief captured in 1581 with traditional horror stories to sell copies. The pamphlet's author, Caspar Herber, does not appear in any other well-known documents. He might have been a hack writer of the day, maybe. But still, we can't just dismiss the story outright. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, as they say. The late 16th century did produce some real serial murderers. Just look at Niers, for example. He was executed in the very same year and region where Genipperteinga supposedly met his end. It could be in the wake of Niers' capture, even more exaggerated stories sprung up to captivate the public, essentially turning a criminal into a kind of legend. But whether it is legend or reality, the tale of Christman Genipperteinga certainly had a long reach. It was reprinted and retold for centuries. Later writers sometimes conflated him with other figures or gave him aliases. In one compendium, he's called Christoph Nipperdoliger. By the 18th century, Christman's story was included in chronicles as a curious anecdote, and by the 19th century, it had entered folklore collections. Generations of readers encountered the name and shuddered at the thought of a man who single-handedly depopulated entire stretches of the countryside. So in a way, he became a symbol of the ultimate social deviant, the bandit whose greed and bloodlust knew no boundaries. And even if he never truly existed, his story tells us about the fears of ordinary people in medieval Germany. That's the fear of traveling alone through the forest roads, of being kidnapped, killed by a stranger, and the fear of that fringe dweller, the other, who rejects all social norms, even to the point of cannibalism and infanticide. Well, the Genipperteinga saga, therefore, is valuable to historians as a cultural artifact, if anything, reflecting how crime was imagined and moralized in that era. It sits at the intersection of fact and folklore, reminding us that medieval true crime often walked hand in hand with legend. But no discussion of medieval German serial killers would be complete without talking about Peter Stumpp, a man whose violent crimes earned him the nickname the Werewolf of Bedburg. His case from 1589 shows how supernatural interpretations were mixed in with real serial killings. And unlike Christian Genipperteinga, Peter Stumpp is a well-documented historical figure, albeit one whose story was quickly sensationalized. Stumpp's notoriety comes not only from the brutality of his murders, but from the fact he was accused of being a werewolf, capable of shape-shifting into a wolf to carry out the attacks. Peter Stumpp was a prosperous farmer in the rural town of Bedburg near Cologne in the electorate of Cologne. Outwardly, he appeared to be an ordinary middle-aged man, a widower with teenage children, living in a community of neighbors who initially trusted him. However, during the mid to late 1580s, the region was plagued by a series of gruesome murders and disappearances. Women and children were found slain in the fields or woods, torn apart as if by wild animals. Rumors began to spread of a wolf-like creature stalking the area. Eventually, suspicion, perhaps guided by someone who had seen Stumpp near one of the crime scenes, fell upon Peter. And so in 1589, Stumpp was arrested and interrogated, likely again under torture given the era's legal practices, which was the style at the time. What came forth was one of the most lurid confessions in history. Stumpp confessed to killing 16 people, including 13 children and 2 pregnant women. He even admitted that one of those children was his own son, whose brain he had savagely eaten. Stumpp described how he had been an insatiable bloodsucker since youth, hunting not just livestock — he did kill goats and sheep too, by the way — but humans as well, devouring their flesh. He recounted ripping unborn fetuses from the wombs of the women he attacked and eating their hearts, which he called dainty morsels. Such graphic cannibalism shows the crimes attributed to Niers and others too. Certainly rhymes, doesn't it? Suggesting perhaps a common trope in the confessions of the time or a reflection of genuine derangement. Stumpp's violence also had a sexual dimension. He was accused of SA and of maintaining an incestuous relationship with his own daughter, Sybil. Furthermore, he claimed to have coupled with a succubus sent to him by the devil. All these details painted a picture of a man depraved beyond the ordinary, a man wholly given over to dark forces. Crucially, Stumpp explained how he managed these atrocities. You see, he blamed the devil's magic. According to his own confession, at the age of 12 he made a pact with the devil, who gave him a magical wolf's pelt. Whenever Stumpp put it on his girdle, he would transform into the likeness of a greedy, devouring wolf, strong and mighty, with the eyes great and large, which in the night sparkled like fire, a mouth of sharp teeth, and a huge body with mighty paws. End of quote. So in this wolf form, he prowled the countryside, free to sate his appetite on human flesh. When he removed the belt, he returned to human form, appearing completely harmless. Authorities actually searched for this alleged wolf's pelt-made belt in the valley Stumpp indicated, but unsurprisingly they found nothing. And the story of the belt is classic werewolf folklore, but Stumpp's own belief, or at least what he stated in it, suggests that he might have been under a sort of delusion, or simply knew what his torturers would find acceptable in the 1580s. Stumpp's trial attracted massive attention, of course. It became perhaps the harshest and most famous werewolf trial in Germany. In October of 1589, he was put to death, in a way that mirrors the cruelty assigned to him. The execution of Peter Stumpp was once again a public spectacle, clearly intended to serve as both punishment and deterrent, and perhaps also an exorcism of the werewolf's evil. Well, first, Stumpp was strapped tightly onto a large breaking wheel with red-hot pincers. The executioners tore the flesh from his body in several places. In fact, the illustrations of the execution show 10 such wounds corresponding to the 10 murders of which he initially suspected of, though his confession, of course, expanded the count. Next, still on the wheel, his limbs were broken. Using the blunt side of an axe or a hammer, the executioner smashed his arms and legs, breaking the bone so he could not support himself. After this torture, he was decapitated with a sword. Death likely came at this point, if not earlier, from shock. Finally, his body, along with the bodies of his daughter Sybil and his mistress, both of whom had been judged complicit in the sins, at least in the incest, were burned to ashes on a pyre. It is recorded that as a warning against any similar pact with the devil, the authorities took a wheel and mounted Stumpp's severed head upon it, topped with the figure of a wolf. A grisly trophy was set high on a pole for all to see, a message that the werewolf of Bedburg was dead, and that divine justice had finally triumphed. Now, of course, the case of Peter Stumpp was swiftly disseminated through Europe. A 16-page pamphlet about his crimes and execution, originally printed in German, was translated into other languages quite quickly. An English version was published in London in 1590, under the title A True Discourse, declaring the damnable life and death of one Stumpp Peter. This pamphlet, copies of which survive in the British Library and Lambeth Palace Library, is our main source of detailed information about Stumpp. It presents the account as sober truth, complete with lurid woodcut illustrations of a wolf prowling the execution scenes. The Stumpp story tapped into a vein of fear that was very current, the overlap of witchcraft and the werewolf lore. During this period, many educated people thought that werewolves were essentially male witches, individuals, often men, who made a pact with the devil for the power to transform and commit harmful magic, this maleficium. The Stumpp pamphlet makes this connection explicit by emphasizing his deal with the devil, and it served as a kind of cautionary tale in the witch-hunting literature of the time. But of course, modern observers have tried to decipher the reality behind the werewolf legend. Some have asked, was Peter Stumpp truly a deranged killer? Or could he have been a scapegoat, executed for crimes he did not commit? Given the fragmentary evidence, i.e. no court records survived, only propaganda like news pamphlets, we can't entirely be sure. But the consistency of details, multiple victims, cannibalism, incest, it suggests that something was beyond pure invention. Possibly Stumpp was a real serial murderer, and the community, lacking any other explanation, attributed it to werewolfery. Or perhaps local authorities needed to explain a spate of wolf attacks on livestock and children, and through torture induced Stumpp to confess to being the supernatural culprit. It has even been theorized that there could have been a real wolf, or wolves attacking people, i.e. rabid wolves were not uncommon in Germany at the time. The panicked populace then sought a human agent to blame. Now Stumpp, as a somewhat wealthy farmer who had survived the loss of a hand, his left hand was missing, hence Stumpp, might have actually been a convenient target if he was disliked or seen as eccentric. The pamphlet in fact alludes to the idea that he was called Stumpp due to losing a hand, and that corresponded to the wolf in the story having its left forepaw cut off in an encounter, as I interpreted as linking the man to the wolf. But regardless of the underlying truth, the cultural impact of the Peter Stumpp case was significant. It fueled a series of subsequent werewolf trials across Germany and France in the 1590s. For instance, in the Duchy of Jülich, not far from Bedburg, a supposed werewolf was also tried in 1591, likely inspired by Stumpp's precedent. The idea of a serial killer as a shape-shifting monster took firm root. Stumpp entered the popular culture, likely from cautionary folk songs to much later inclusions in books about demonology and lycanthropy, notably by occultist authors like Montague Summers in the 20th century. And today he's often cited as one of the earliest serial killers in Western history, certainly one of the earliest whose crimes were so extensively recorded. And so, these three cases that we've detailed, Niers, Genipperteinga, and Stumpp, they're the most famous serial murderer tales from medieval or early modern Germany. And they highlight different facets. Niers, the organized bandit, occultist. Christman, the legendary cave-dwelling mass murderer. And of course Stumpp, the werewolf. But they were by no means the only ones whispered about in their time. They had other figures too, and also a few legends that belong in this discussion before we finish up. One such figure is Simon Fleischer, a name that appears in an old pamphlet listing multiple notorious murderers of the 16th century. According to that pamphlet, Simon Fleischer was a medieval German serial killer who specialized in a particular crime. He would marry wealthy women and then murder them for their money. Reportedly, he confessed, again under torture, to 19 such murders, making him a sort of Bluebeard long before the French folktale by that name was coined. Fleischer's methodical approach, using marriage as a trap, stands out as almost proto-psychopathic, a male version of the Black Widow, this kind of thing. Of course, his end was as terrible as any, executed by being torn apart with red-hot pincers over 3 days, similar to the tortures inflicted on Niers and Stumpp. But the interesting thing is that Fleischer's story survives only in a single account, which grouped him alongside Genipperteinga and Niers, and that account is anonymous and of dubious historicity. It implies that Fleischer's tale might have been a fictional addition to the canon of infamous murderers, but it also shows how over time a catalogue of villains was constructed, blending real and imagined to satisfy the public's morbid curiosity. Another category of multiple murderers in medieval Germany were the Schinderhands-type bandits and robber knights who, not serial killers in a modern sense of a singular compulsion, nonetheless killed repeatedly in the course of their careers. For example, Hans of Eppingen, nicknamed Hans Trap in the late 15th century, was a German knight turned robber who reputedly delighted in cruelty, earning him a place in local legend as a child-eating ogre. He became a kind of German Santa Claus anti-figure in folklore. While much of his story is mythologized, it likely stems from a real person who committed violent robberies. Similarly, Jasper Hainbuth, in the early 17th century, which is beyond our medieval period, but we'll mention it, was a former mercenary who, after the 30 Years' War, became a highwayman around Hanover and murdered perhaps 19 people. Hainbuth was eventually caught and executed by the breaking wheel in 1653. A later example, sure, but it demonstrates the continuity. In the northern German regions, we encounter names like Papedon and Liepold, which might sound odd, but they're rooted in older dialects, you must understand. These were legendary outlaws, said to have murdered multiple travelers or children. One 18th century scholar investigating Mecklenburg folklore found references to a Rauber Papdon, who was essentially a local robber/boogeyman, likely an echo of real medieval fears. Everything comes from somewhere, you see. Now, the story of Liepold, that is interesting. In one legend, Liepold was a 13th century treasurer of the Margrave of Brandenburg, who was executed for intrigue, but the folk tales recast him as a bloodthirsty murderer of innocents, possibly to serve as a moral fable about trust and evil. Now, these examples show that the idea of a serial murderer existed in the cultural imagination even when the documentation was thin. But beyond individual names, medieval Germany had patterns of crime that lent themselves to serial killing. Feuds and outlawry could lead someone to committing multiple murders. For instance, as part of a feud, a knight might ambush and kill several enemies one by one, though that borders on war, not serial murder for private thrills. And then there were the poisoners. They also existed. One might mention the case of a female poisoner like Anna Schindenwein, or others in the 1700s, but in medieval times, poisoning serially was rarer or at least less documented. Well, that is with the partial exception of some witch trial accusations of poison over time. But interestingly, the concept of a woman as a serial killer is nearly absent in the medieval German records. Most of the famed cases are men, reflecting perhaps the realities of physical violence, I suppose. Well, in comparing medieval German serial killers to their counterparts elsewhere, you must find similar figures in neighboring regions. For example, Gilles de Rais in France, a nobleman executed in 1440 for murdering dozens of children, often considered history's first serial killers, or one of. And then we have Elizabeth Bathory in Hungary, the countess accused of torturing and killing perhaps 100 young women around 1600, but once again, that is debated. But while those aren't German, they do show that serial killing was a phenomena not limited by geography. But what isn't really notable is that in each case, the interpretations vary. Ray's crimes were seen as partly in a satanic/occult light. Some charged he was invoking demons, while Bathory's were entangled with perceptions of female wickedness, and perhaps even political motivations. In German principalities, the consistent theme is that serial killers were treated as an existential threat to the moral and social order, and as such, their punishment was often the harshest available to the imagination, and their memory was either wiped out, executed and remains destroyed, or in some cases, turned into a cautionary tale of lore. So what did you learn today, As we finish up, what can we take from these medieval killers in Germany? Well, the accounts are sobering, of course. They're often ghastly. But it's also once again a unique window into the fears and values of that era. In a time when life could be brutally short, and authorities struggled to maintain order across fragmented territories. The figure of the serial murderer represented the ultimate breakdown of the social pact. He, nearly always a he in the German records, was the wolf in human form. The savage, the outsider who didn't just kill in hot passion or under command in war, but killed over and over again by their own choice, in defiance of all morality. Well, medieval Germans responded by demonizing them, branding them as devils or werewolves, and by eradicating them with merciless punishment. Of course, in our modern day, we don't have the breaking wheel anymore, but we still call people monsters. We still call people demons when they exhibit this behavior. It's kind of hard to view them as human when you look at them committing these sorts of crimes. Maybe if we humanize them, there's a part of ourselves that we might fear. I don't know. What do you think? I'm sure you'll let me know in the comments if you're not already asleep. But if you are, I hope none of these murderers are infiltrating your dreams. In any case, I'm going to thank the top-tier patrons and supporters. It's Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Kerry, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfednir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Talbury, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Neftus, Alexander, Gokhan, Dorsey, Benita, Claire, Courtesy, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari, Yvette, Miss Mochi, 11, Allison, Free American, Jennifer, Brittany, David, Cody, Brian, Are You My Mum? Rhonda, Carrie, Cathy P, Lovely, Poma, Kevin, Marissa, Altazakin, and Lucy. Thank you very much. Okay, well that's it from me tonight, unless you want to go watch another video, in which case, feel free to do so. But I'm going to go and have a little rest now. Good night, everyone. Thank you for joining me. Lots of love to all of you out there in the world, and good luck out there. Farewell for now.